Hey, good morning, everybody. Yeah, that's right. It's morning, and Mike and I are here hanging by the skin of our teeth. Think about that for a moment. Skin of your teeth. Do you know anybody that's got skin on your teeth? I mean, you bite into a hot dog. Ow, give me a Band-Aid. My teeth are bleeding. But I guess there must be something to it somewhere, and somebody in the cloud or in the stream will tell us about it today. But we may not see it because Mike and I both had late nights last night. Mike's just come in a rush from Charlotte. I might have been out last night bending elbows with some of the lawyers in the Proud Boys case as we continue to wait for a jury. But we both thought, hey, are we going to be late today? Are we going to be at all? Here we are. We don't have banners. We're just we're just running naked today.
Well, we got one banner. Look at this. Boom.
Oh no, but is it day 83 or is it day 84?
It's
I
83.
thought it was okay. I've lost track. So we enter the seventh
It may
day.
be day 84.
Yeah, because yesterday was day 83.
Right.
I mean, I realize I'm asking a lot. I'm an awful lot of both of us.
I'm an attorney. I'm not a mathematician. This is ridiculous.
I know 1 + 1 = whatever it is.
The 7th day of the jury deliberations.
Well, and it hasn't been 7 full days. Yesterday the jury left.
Enter 7th, so we're going into the 7th, right?
So as the calendar flows, this is the seventh day of court proceedings in which we've sat around wondering what's going to become of our clients. And yesterday, however, the jury left at noon because one of them had a commitment. But we were all a Twitter because they'd noticed a typographical error in the verdict form. The verdict form is that sheet of paper on which they enter their verdict and return it to the court. And we had the number 1 where 4 should have been at some point, and it mattered as you manipulated the sheet. So we get a note and they notice this and we're like, holy cow, 13 lawyers have been litigating this case in the well of the court. You got a judge up on the bench and he's got his clerks and his staff, and none of us noticed this, and it took the jury to notice it. And it really, in my view, wasn't material, and it was obvious that the juror understood the deeper rhythm of the case because they ignored the typo, but they wanted it cleaned up. And so I drew the inference that they wanted it cleaned up only because they were about to report the verdict and wanted this historic document to be in proper form. So I thought, we're getting the verdict today, but we didn't. So today is the last full day of jury deliberations between now and May 12th. And how do I know that? Because on Monday of this week, I should say, the jury sent a note saying we have scheduling conflicts among us on the following days, and it's every day hereafter until May 12th. So we'll have a half day here, a half day there, no day on a week from today, next Thursday. So my hunch is that on their last full day together, they could, and they probably will, report a verdict. And that may just be my hope speaking. That when last I checked, I resided in Connecticut and in Vermont, and had a family and a law firm and that purported to love me, and pets that loved me. But I haven't seen much of these folks for the last 5 months, and I'd like to be home. So let's see what happens in Proud Boyville. I'm stunned. I don't know what to make of the Jordan Neely death in the New York subway. For those of you who haven't heard about it, Jordan Neely apparently was a man with mental health issues and challenges, and he was a good Michael Jackson impersonator. So he would entertain folks on the subway by doing his Michael Jackson routine, and presumably this is how he lived. He lived by the contributions of strangers, living by his wits, and he had some wit, but he wasn't Mother Teresa in drag. He also had a quite lengthy criminal record, some 40 arrests, and he's somebody known to law enforcement. Now, if you've ever ridden the subways in New York City, you realize that it can be a sort of terrifying experience. The doors close and suddenly you're in a car between stations in a dark tunnel. And I know this is beginning to sound like a bad episode of Woody Allen, but and anything can happen. And the train sometimes stalls between stops, and you're crammed in close quarters with strangers, and you don't know what's going to happen next. So according to press reports, Neely was in a subway, Lower Manhattan, and he began to speak in a way that caused some alarm with others in the car. He was looking for help. If you don't get it, I need help. If you can't get it, I'm prepared to go back to prison. I'm prepared to die. And I don't know what his demeanor was when he said these things, but I can tell you that if I'm sitting on a subway and the guy next to me says, "Oh, you're reading the New York Times. Hey, listen, I need some help. Can you help me? I'm tired of asking for help. I'm prepared to go back to prison. I'm ready to die." I'm going to be thinking, this is probably somebody who's not working the crossword puzzle, and maybe I would move. But I wouldn't want to move, because if I move, that would show fear. And if I show fear, that shows vulnerability. And if I show vulnerability, that may attract more of his attention rather than less. And so regular strap hangers in New York know the beauty of what I refer to as the New York stare. When you get on the subway in Manhattan, you find a place 1,000 yards away, and you keep your focus on that no matter what happens around you, because engagement is potentially dangerous. Well, in the subway car with Neely, he began these utterances, and there was a young, I guess, former Marine, I believe he was a 24-year-old, who got Neely into a chokehold and held him down and restrained him. And this went on for some time, maybe 15 minutes. Neely drifted into unconsciousness and then died. And so now there's the medical examiner has concluded that this was homicide, that is taking of a human life by another human. And the man who held Neely will either be charged or not. He will likely be charged with some lesser form of homicide. So I look at all of that, and I'm like, well, okay, it's another day in the subways in New York and another reason to take Uber or walk. But yet by the end of the day yesterday, there were storm clouds gathering in the New York subway system. And suddenly we'd found this year's new George Floyd. And there's now there's a tribute to Jordan Neely in the subway station near which he died. Flowers are gathered, and people are calling for justice for Jordan. And I'm beginning to wonder whether this isn't going to become the Bernard Goetz light scenario of our time. You'll recall the Bernie Goetz shootings years ago, and I believe it was in the late 70s, early 80s in Manhattan. Bernie was a white guy. And by the way, Neely was black, and the man who killed him was white. So this will become racialized in any moment, if it hasn't already. In the Goetz case, he was being roughed up and taunted by some teenagers who happened to be black, and Goetz happened to be white. And he pulled out a gun and shot him. I lived in Manhattan at the time, and I was ready to vote for Goetz as mayor after he did that, because, well, I see you smiling, Mike, but I thought finally somebody stood up for some public order, and, these kids were preying upon people in the subway. And, as they say in Proud Boy land, FAFO, I've learned in the trial, fuck around and find out. So Neely is sort of like a Goetz light situation at this point. We have a guy obviously in the throes of a mental health crisis, perhaps having one of the worst days of an otherwise bad life, acting out and perhaps agitated. A person on the train just decided to take matters into their own hand and impose some measure of order on his own, and Neely died.
Well, so one thing here, because Lawyer Will, good morning, Lawyer Will, makes an interesting observation.
Lawyer Will always makes interesting observations.
That I think cuts against what you were just saying about, this year's or the new George Floyd. We don't have video. And in the absence of video, this is going to be a much more difficult case to illustrate for people all over the place, right?
Well, we don't have video yet. I mean, it's incomprehensible to me that there is not a video. I've seen a photograph of the fellow holding Neely, and so that photograph might have been an isolated shot, but I'm guessing videos will surface in the days to come.
We will see. We will see. And 24 years old, former Marine, it says. So this is going to be a really interesting case to follow, just because I think that there are going to be a lot of people sympathetic to the general sense of what has happened to the subway system in Manhattan and New York City. So there will be
obviously, well, not just that, but what's happening in our cities in general. I don't spend a lot of time in big cities, so this has been Ferris Bueller's 5 months off, as I've spent time, off the ranch, as it were, off the farm, as I've spent time in DC. DC is a creepy place at night and in the early evening and in the early morning. I mean, I went down to the laundry room in the Airbnb that, apartment building I'm in at 6:15 the other morning, and there's a homeless guy sleeping on the machines. How did he get into the building? I didn't want to disturb him because I didn't know what he'd do, so I turned around and decided I'd do my laundry another time. If you're out on the streets, it's almost always the case that you're going to get panhandled, and some of the panhandlers are aggressive. And some of them are using racial epithets. Hey, I was at lunch at a sidewalk cafe not long ago. A guy came up to another lawyer and I, and asked for some money, and we said no. And he started berating us as a couple of white guys in suits, and we turned to him and said, "How did this become about race?" And and then things got a little uglier. And he left, and somebody must have reported him to the police, and they came looking for him. But you get the sense, at least I get the sense in our cities, that you're always one step away from menace, one step away from violence, and that this sense of menace and violence is tinged with racial overtones. And so when I look at this killing on the subway, part of me is rooting for the guy who strangled Neely. It's like, finally, somebody's imposed some order here. But some other part of me says, hey, we've got a vast cohort of people in this society who are not integrated into the society as a whole, and we're failing to deal with them. And, as if to confirm that intuition, the Hartford Courant last week reported, in an ungainly headline, de facto institutions. I think they meant de facto institutionalization, but that's too big of a word to put into a headline. In Connecticut, 95.5% of prison inmates.
Oh no, that was a very intentional de facto institutions, right? That they have become mental asylums de facto, right?
Yeah, but that's not. But a prison is an institution, So I mean, But I get your point. I'm just being picayune. But 95.5% of people in prison have mental illness, and that's right. I suspect that a significant percent do. But let's think for a moment about what we're doing. I mean, we're saying that a person, what is criminal law? It used to be in the old days, in the 50s and 60s, that sociologists and company and others talked about deviance, that there were expected and settled norms, which, when broken, required some sort of response. And so a juvenile delinquent had deviated from the norms. A person who committed a crime had deviated from the norms. We needed to rehabilitate them. We needed to protect society, and so we have juvenile detention centers. We have prisons. We had, at various points in this country, asylums for those who were unable to control their conduct or keep their conduct within the requirements of the law, and the serious mentally ill would go there. And we concluded as a society that was inhumane, and that these were often warehouses of suffering, and people weren't getting treatment. The development of psychotropic medications that could control more serious symptoms of mental illness made it possible to harbor the belief that we could medicate people into a point where, if they were given appropriate community support, they would no longer need to be institutionalized. And isn't that what a more humane society would do? And so we all bought the head notes and closed the institutions, and set these people out onto the streets, but we deprived them of the community support we need. And lo and behold, we now have streets clogged with mentally ill people, and there's no place to put them. So if we won't commit to the community resources that they need, the law has evolved to a point where it's hard to agree on norms. And sometimes we say we want to protect the eccentric, even if the eccentricities are driven by mental illness. And surprise, 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 some of these folks end up becoming involved in violence, and then we lock them up because they're ill. And they're dangerous because they're ill, and we say we're locking them up because they're dangerous, but we're not looking at their mental health needs. That is inhumane. On the other hand, what else are we going to do? I saw a story in a local newspaper the other day of a young man being sentenced to prison for 25 years after pleading guilty to murder. He shot another guy in cold blood and wounded another person. Now, for those, and I knew the jurisdiction in which this person was convicted, and I knew that to be a shockingly low number for a crime of that sort. And the reason is that, in that jurisdiction, it's in Connecticut, murder carries a mandatory minimum of 25 years and a maximum of 60. So you only get 25 years if in fact, I've never pled somebody to that low. I've had an offer of 27 years in a murder once, as the client rejected it, and we're going to have to go to trial. And so, I did some inquiring and came to learn that the young man in question was sentenced to prison for 25 years because he's seriously mentally ill. He's a schizophrenic. And I'm thinking to myself, where is the justice in that? Basically what we're saying is he's too dangerous to be released, too sick to be trusted on his own on the street. We don't have the ability to provide him with treatment, so we're going to just lock him up. And isn't this just reinstitutionalization? And isn't this reinstitutionalization of a form that's worse than what we had before? Because now, we're going to send this guy into a facility that is ill-equipped to deal with his mental health needs, and he's going to have to deal with others. And God only knows what forms of shocking violence he will be subject to, or he will subject others to, including prison staff. Because what we're doing is we're taking people who lack the ability to control themselves and we're warehousing them with others. And do we expect anything other than violence and inhumanity of one toward another? And so, I called a prosecutor who's, close to that jurisdiction. I said, what the hell's going on? And they were in despair because there's nothing else to do with the person. And they've bought some temporary relief for society as a whole, but they've bought that relief at the expense of what arguably is humane and just. And so I guess you heard it here first, folks. I think it's time to have a serious discussion about reopening asylums.
Well,
And
Norm, I can't help but to think about here in North Carolina, one of the most well-known mental health hospitals is Dorothea Dix Hospital, and it was founded in like 1856, I think, and lasted until 2010. And at that point, it sat on, I think, over 300 acres, and it had large history to that. And I remember, 2010, I'm turning about 20 and stuff like, and I still remember there was at that time, that was sort of the trending thing, was that mental institutions, lunatic asylums, as they were once called, were being defunded and sort of going the way of the dinosaur. And that was the conversation. It was at the same time as I think the, school to prison pipeline rhetoric was becoming increasingly popular. And for a long time, I have wondered, when we see the rise in homelessness, especially in more densely populated areas, and it's obvious to any casual observer that many of these people that you see that are homeless and wandering about are not within a logical frame of mind, right? They're not balanced. There's something off. And I think anecdotally we can hear stories about certain types of people that when the wintertime comes, depending on where they live, there are crimes that they'll commit just so that they can make sure that they get inside,
yeah,
get 3 square meals and a bed.
3 hots and a cot.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think that this is something that I have had a passing interest in, but I think I'll start to dive a little deeper on the history, not only of Dorothea Dix, but what it was about society and culture, because it seems pretty obvious that this is something that is right in the orbit of what we cover a lot on Law and Legitimacy when we talk about these notions of woke, right, and spending the capital.
Well, yeah, but there's a deeper drama to it. I mean, the name came to mind suddenly. There's a psychologist, maybe a psychiatrist by the name of R.D. Lang, who back in the 60s and 70s would write that the mentally ill aren't mentally ill. Their experience is just different, and what they express in the forms of their deviance is a critique of our norms, and therefore we need to make room for their expression and to become a more tolerant and open-minded society. And I think that the failure of that, the problem with that insight, however true it may be in a limited aspect, is it ignores a larger reality. And those of you with children listening, you may want to plug their ears right now. Some people are just batshit crazy. And you can dress them up any way you want to, but they need restraint. And to protect, and as a society, are we prepared to draw those lines, those hard lines? And I think we're reluctant to do so now. And I think that reluctance is imposing a tremendous social cost on the rest of us. It's almost daily that on social media you can see homeless camps in various cities. There was one meme shown yesterday. Would you pay $7,500 a month for your rent in Los Angeles if this was right outside your door? And it was a shocking scene of people on sidewalks in various stages of decline. And so, Justin points out in an earlier comment, Justin Carta, all state-run facilities are managed. All state-run facilities are managed horribly, prisons or rehab centers. That's the problem. They must be private businesses to succeed. Well, they may be managed horribly, but the problem with a private facility is if you're going to have a regime that says some people cannot care for themselves and must be institutionalized, they're going to become wards of the state. And if the state enters into a contract to privatize the care of the mentally ill, maybe it'll be better managed, maybe it won't. But the need to address public standards of commitment, the need to address public standards of decent and efficacious care for the mentally ill hasn't disappeared. I think the experiment with deinstitutionalization has failed, and we've kicked the crisis down the road. And now we're all living with it. And that, to me, is what's reflected in the Jordan Neely homicide on the subway in Manhattan. And I think it should serve not as an occasion to have further discussions of systemic racism and how to make Jordan Neely's family into multimillionaires because a white guy killed a black guy. I think what we need to ask ourselves is, how do we deal with the ill among us, and how do we provide them with minimum standards of care while providing the rest of us with safety and security in public places?
Yeah,
it's not that hard.
Well, and it's also not lost on me that we live in a time of ubiquitous pharmaceutical drugs, right? Mm-hmm. And so you hear these new terms around anxiety and apprehension in younger people, and what cell phones and social media are doing to young brains, and self-esteem and confidence and self-image and all these things. And then there's a drug for every single, micro apprehension under the sun. And it does feel as though American culture has really failed its citizens in this respect, because it does appear to me that the reason that we would not arc our way back into some sort of institution-based system for those with mental illness, right, involuntary commitments, what have you, that it's largely because people still don't want to be labeled as racist. They don't want to be labeled as insensitive. And I acknowledge that what you're talking about, Norm, with respect to Justin's comment, sure, I think that in theory, privatization of almost any industry will conceivably be a better yield of a product and or service. I think, however, that the profit motive is perhaps what cuts against that, because as we've seen with private prisons, the things that get cut the most are the things that the institutionalized need most. Right. Yeah. And that is that's an intangible act of what we would need these facilities to do. I personally don't think that our medical profession has the infrastructure to be able to arc its way back at this point anyway. I think that just normal people out in the world right now are having trouble getting basic medical needs met in a competent and timely manner, and we don't talk enough about that as a society. So I think that there's quite a lot of trouble here for us to wade through in the coming decade.
Oh, I think there is, and I think it's exacerbated by basically the rush of immigrants, undocumented immigrants into the United States, which is driven by any number of causes. And so, at a time when our local communities are overrun with caring for the infirm and indigent in our own communities, we're inviting the world in, and it may be satisfying to some version of ourselves as infinitely generous, but we're not. We all have limited capacities and a bandwidth that is capable of absorbing only so much. And as things become rubbed raw, there are going to be more incidents like the Jordan Neely incident. Hey, I want to do a quick pivot because we're almost out of time to the
Lawyer Will says, when the homeless guy at the grocery store told me to F myself and he hoped I died, he was just critiquing my norms.
Yes. Oh, and of course, that was a, it might have been an abrupt and somewhat rude comment on your norms, and then the appropriate response would have been to offer to buy him groceries for the year. The fact that you didn't, Lawyer Will, and that you choose to spend your time with us is proof that you're a heartless cretin, and that your brother Pete Atkinson, the candidate for sainthood, will get there far before you do. But in the meantime, we'll keep coming back because Mike and I are sinners in need of grace, and we prefer the company of sinners. Donald Trump trial Jean Carroll, startled. Well, I don't know that people were startled, but it was reported yesterday in breathless tones that Donald's lawyer, Joe Tacopino, announced that they're not going to put on a defense in this civil case involving Jean Carroll's claim that Donald raped her years ago. But what was stunning to me in the stories is Tacopino and company had an expert to counter the expert psychologist the state offered, and the man, quote unquote, fell ill. And so the Ms. Carroll's lawyer is going to go unrebutted, and that expert's testimony is a classic example of junk science. And what am I talking about? Junk in trial, most witnesses are what are called percipient witnesses. They have perceived something, seen, heard, smelled, rarely tasted, felt something that they report on, and they report on their perceptions, and jurors weigh those reports and make of them what they can to find facts. Those are fact witnesses. Some witnesses are called expert witnesses, and a court permits a witness to testify as an expert if that person has education, skill, training, or experience that a normal person does not possess. And their testimony about the meaning of facts would assist the jury. So, classic example, you see a brick wall, you and I see a brick wall, a structural engineer may see a fault. The engineer can say, based on my training, skill, and experience, the fault in that brick wall was such that it was likely to collapse, and it did collapse. That would be an example of an expert. In sexual assault cases, there is a growing industry of delayed and incremental disclosure experts who are permitted to testify that people who've been sexually assaulted respond in different in discernible and predictable ways. They are reluctant to disclose their trauma out of shame and often wait many years. That's delayed disclosure. When they get to the point of talking about it, it's so painful they can only reveal parts of it at a time, and therefore they're inconsistent. A defense lawyer attacks the delays as saying it didn't happen because if it was so bad then, where have you been for the last 20 years? And that inconsistencies aren't a function of delayed or incremental disclosure, but rather are inconsistencies as a result of recent fabrication. Here's the problem with this testimony. There is no double-blind study that permits you to say anything other than the following. All people who complain about sexual assaults behave in the same way. But what the unanswered question is, how many people who complain of sexual assaults were actually sexually assaulted? All children who trick or treat behave in the more or less same way, but not many of them are really goblins. I mean, they're dressed up in a role. And
think about how ridiculous this testimony is. It's quoted in this Washington Examiner article. It says, quote, this is the clinical psychologist that Carroll's legal team put on for examination. And the quote that they use here is, quote, for many years, she just simply blamed herself for the assault, thought she did something stupid, and that's why it happened. And it gets exactly to what you're saying. I don't think that even a first-year law student would not have too much trouble cross-examining this, right? Because the threshold question must be, how do you know that she was sexually assaulted, right?
And she doesn't, and that's the problem. I once had one of these experts on stand in a child sex case in Danbury, Connecticut, and I said, so basically what you're saying, you don't take any position on whether Jane or whatever the child's name was actually assaulted. No, you're just saying that all people that make the same complaint that she does sound the same way. I said, would you say the same thing of people who claim to eat pizza on the dark side of the moon? I don't understand your question. Suppose 4 people came in and they talked about eating pizza on the dark side of the moon. You would say all of those people reported similar things, correct? Yes. Does that mean they ate pizza on the dark side of the moon? That's a ridiculous question, Counselor. Of course it is. But it wouldn't matter to you whether they actually ate pizza on the dark side of the moon, because that's not why you're here. And ultimately, she had to say yes. And for whatever reasons, judges permit this garbage or junk science testimony. And so it was, I think, a huge mistake on Tacopino's behalf not to bring in a countervailing expert to talk about this. I think the likelihood is that Trump will be found liable for the Carroll rape, and I think it's because of the junk science that was permitted, because of his comments on Access Hollywood that he could grab women by the crotch, and they just love it, which is apparently what Carroll said he did, and because of the fact that they had other acts testimony, other women who claimed that Trump had sexually assaulted them, and finally because it's Donald Trump in Manhattan. I mean, that's like me at a Burger King. You really think I'm not going to order a cheeseburger? So I mean, I think that stay tuned on that trial. I think he's
I think I'm just curious thinking about the decision not to offer up a counter expert. And I don't have the trial transcript, so we have
the claim is that he became ill. And there's just something that smells like BS.
I don't believe that.
Yeah, it smells like BS to me.
And if that's the case, Norm, I mean, are there not mechanisms within the court's discretion to reschedule based on that illness, right? If a party perceives that to be a critical witness and then there is an illness, right? Is there not some way to actually delay or forestall, that day?
Yeah, well, there could be, but it depends how ill the guy is and what actually happened and when. And so who knows? We'll find out. Carter will say punishment levied. Well, this will be a financial punishment. It's a civil case. She'll ask for money damages. I guess low when it came to the Dominion settlement, but I'm going to say she gets a $5 million verdict. That's my hunch.
Not quite Dominion money. Oh man.
So
what we got here? Oh yeah. What is that? Norm at the
Mohegan Sun. Yeah. So I'm beginning to work up my material, and I can tell you, it looks like I'm going to adopt a new role as a coffin salesman. We will be talking about safe sex and the benefits of identifying as a tax-exempt corporation. So be prepared. It starts at 10 o'clock. It's at the Mohegan Sun Casino. That's in Eastern Connecticut. It's quite a trip for some of you.
My pronouns are Corp Inc.
I love that line. I'm stealing it. I'm always stealing it. I'm a thief. I identify as a corporation and I steal your ideas. My pronouns are Corp and Inc. And if you don't like it, that's too bad.
Man. Well, we're hoping we're on, verdict watch for the rest of the day. I know that you sense that things are close. I certainly think that we're at the end of the road here, just based on my knowledge of what you're doing day to day. So I'm hoping for a swift verdict here this morning, and then safe travels for you, irrespective of what the verdict is, back to your family up in Connecticut, Norm.
Well, we have a farewell bacchanal planned for all the lawyers for tonight. So I won't be on the road till tomorrow, assuming I'm in a condition to drive, and I'm sure I will be. But stay tuned. We're hoping that the jury is thinking. We're hoping for not guilties on as many counts as possible. It's been a tough trial, and after 83 or 84 days, it's time. Let's get that verdict and let's move on.
Absolutely. All right. Well, you can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Play, Overcast, etc. for all the audio-only listeners. And if you're here, please put a thumbs up on this video. I think it's nothing short of a miracle that we made it on time this morning. I'm still just sort of beside myself at getting 2 hours up the road, hitting this on time, and getting the stream set up. So look, we're reps are important. I used to have a coach in football. He's like, we need reps. And all the reps we've gotten over the last 4 months have just prepared us for this moment. You just set up and you perform.
Nothing is impossible, but don't get too outside yourself and too far or too much beside yourself. That's a euphemism for mentally ill. You might be put in prison rather than getting the institutional care you so grossly need.
Well, I've got you to defend me, Norm.
In which case, you'll go to prison.
See you later.
All right, bye.